Welcome, and thank you so much for being here for our bi-monthly Bridge Book Club event. My name is Amber DeLinde. I'm the Membership and Engagement Director at Bridge, and today we are discussing What the Eyes Don't See by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. Today's event is hosted by Bridge, Michigan. I'm joined here today on our Zoom by Josiah Foster, who is the Fund Development Associate at Bridge, Michigan, as well as Robin Erb, who is our health reporter and will also be moderating today's discussion. Thank you both for joining me. In case you don't know or are relatively new to Bridge, Bridge Michigan is Michigan's nonprofit, nonpartisan news source, covering issues that matter to you and to your community. You can subscribe for free if you aren't already at www.bridgemi.com. Also, for those who are current Bridge Club members, who are people who have donated to Bridge sometime in the last year, you receive a number of benefits, including access to free electronic copies of each book in Bridge's book club. You can become a member today by visiting the link that we'll drop in the chat if you aren't already a member. If you are, thank you so much for your support, and it's good to see so many of you. Today, we are incredibly lucky and fortunate to be joined by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who is an author, a pediatrician, all-around rock star, and is here to talk with us today about her book about the Flint water crisis. I'll give you a full introduction of Dr. Mona in a moment, but as I mentioned, we are incredibly honored she was willing to take time out of her schedule to talk with us about her book. The schedule for today's discussion goes a little bit like this. I will introduce Dr. Mona, then hand the microphone over to Robin Erb, who will lead the discussion with Dr. Mona about the book for about 40-45 minutes. And then we'll conclude with reader questions for Dr. Mona. So if you have any questions, you can type those into the chat at any time. Throughout today's discussion, please stay muted. With so many people on the call, it can get tricky if lots of people are talking at once. So please stay muted, but if you have questions, comments, type those right in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those and making sure that Robin gets them to ask as many as we can. We will then conclude right at 1 o'clock. As you heard at the beginning, we are recording this discussion. We'll be sharing it on Bridge's website, bridgemi.com, later this week. So if you want to watch again or want to share on your social media channels or know somebody who wanted to see it but missed it, you'll have a chance to share that link with them. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest today, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. Dr. Mona is a pediatrician, scientist, and activist who has been called to testify twice before the United States Congress, awarded the Freedom of Expression Courage Award by PEN America, and was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Robin Erb, to begin today's discussion. Thank you.
The microphone right now. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm excited to see so many people here today too. Dr. Mona and I were talking right before this. I read the book many years ago and I read it again to get prepared for today. And, you know, both times I was struck by just, you know, Dr. Mona, you painted so beautifully, like your parents' background, their home, the cruelty there that, you know, meant you ended up growing up in Michigan. And then you also described in this extraordinary detail, this snowy night, and having a kid now in the UP, I know what it's like to drive in the upper Michigan in winter. And that was your introduction as a little girl to medicine. So tell us a little more just to start about growing up in Michigan.
Oh, thank you. First, I just want to say, hey to everybody out there. I love book clubs. I love doing this. I love readers. So yay for having a book club and being part of this. Thank you to Bridge, Michigan. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Josiah. Special thank you to Robin. And we have an amazing history. Robin was I think first person to write a profile of me and kind of what was going on. So kudos to all of you in the field of journalism and for those who support journalism. And I'm sure we'll talk about kind of the unsung heroes of the story are also very much our journalists. So growing up in Michigan, if you've read the book, you know, it's a weird book, right? Like, you know, it's about Flint, obviously, and that's the book I started to write. Like, I was just going to write, like, being at the center of this kind of emblematic environmental and public health crisis. But when I started to write that book, just kind of this firsthand account of what was happening in Flint, I quickly realized, hey, I can't tell you about what I did in Flint without telling you more about who I am and where I came from. So this book also kind of became a memoir, and it has, like Robin said, a lot of family history and personal history. And the very first line of the book, which I think like shocks people, are like, wait a minute, this is not what I thought. The very first line is, I am Iraqi, an immigrant born somewhere else. So, I do talk about kind of my upbringing. So, I wasn't supposed to be in this country. It wasn't part of my parents' master plan, which I think is the story for so many immigrants, but we were leaving somewhere bad and coming to somewhere better, which is the story of all immigrants in this country, seeking that American dream of democracy and opportunity and prosperity. And of all places, we landed in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Houghton, Michigan. So yay for all the UPers out there. And my dad did a postdoc training at Michigan Tech University. So imagine, these folks from the Middle East coming to the UP and being part of those winters. And I remember like my dad's having to ski to work and snow covering like our whole, like, the door and like a permanent layer on top of our car, and the ice festival. And so we landed there, and despite the coldness of the UP, we were warmed by the people of Michigan, who kind of welcomed us, especially into that university community. We had a family in Metro Detroit. As you guys know, there's a very large Arab American community in Metro Detroit. My grandmother was there, as well as other folks kind of the growing diaspora from the Middle East. So we would drive often from the UP, from Houghton to Detroit. And if anybody's done that, it's about 12 hours. It's a long drive. And I talk in the book how one of those drives during, a Christmas break around Gaylord is when our car hit an ice patch. And this was kind of before everybody wore seatbelts, and I was tiny and flew back and forth in that car as it kind of hit the side rails and broke my neck and fractured my jaw, and was transported and cared for in Traverse City, and got better. And I think, as Robin said, that was my first experience with kind of medicine. One of the reasons I wanted to go into medicine. After a couple years in the UP, we came down to Metro Detroit. My father worked for General Motors, like most people in the state. The auto industry was part of our life. He worked at the tech center in Warren. My mom became a teacher, taught ESL, English as a second language, to other immigrants. Went to Michigan schools, went to Michigan and then Michigan State for med school, went back to Michigan for a public health degree, went to Wayne State for my residency. So I claim allegiances to like all universities. And obviously, embody so much of what this state, has offered, and have been so privileged to be, to have lived in different parts of the state, and to have kind of, been a student at our great public universities and our public schools, and continue to be privileged to give back to the state, as a pediatrician still in Flint. So that's a little bit about kind of my background and kind of the path. And a couple of years ago, my book was The Great Michigan Read, which was so cool. It was a Michigan Humanities program. I got to travel to every Michigan county to talk about the book and about Michigan and why this is so much a Michigan story. Obviously not just about this bad thing that happened in Michigan, but it representing kind of the whole state in that respect.
Yeah, I'm going off script a little bit, but I was visiting colleges not too long ago with my daughter, and we pulled into Michigan State, and there was the big picture on a banner with the great big Spartans green. I said, look, my daughter, I said, look what you can do, go into science. Anyway, and you're right. We've known each other for a while. And I remember standing, the first time I think I met you personally was in the press conference there, in which the state stood there and they dismissed your analysis. And they said you didn't know what you were talking about. And you were talking in the book about this incredible toll, on you personally and your family and your kids and your husband, but also like these incredible political risks to Flint, to the hospital that you love. Tell us just about those days and why you decided to make this a book.
So, as you read the book, I quickly began to realize that, our kids were in harm's way, and that this data had to be shared. And I never should have had to do this work. I never should have had to do this research. Ultimately it's kind of what, exposed the crisis, but it wasn't, it shouldn't have been necessary. There were so many, red flags that were ignored from the amazing people who spoke up, and the moms and the journalists and the other scientists. And like, we never should have had to have like proof that kids were being poisoned for something to happen. And so, like, when I did this research and I wanted to be proven wrong, like as a scientist, like we have like this null hypothesis. Like I didn't want to find the results that I found. Like, I'm like, please, like, I don't want to see more kids like with elevated lead levels, because like lead is bad. Like, it's like, one of the oldest and most well-studied neurotoxins out there. Like, I didn't want to find that there was more lead, and but that's not what happened. I mean, and it was kind of common sense. Like, there was a lot of lead in our water. So like like there was going to be more lead in kids. And even what we found was kind of an underestimation of the scope of the problem. And then I had a choice to make. So I'm like, well, like, what am I going to do with this? Like, and I, during this whole time, like, stopped sleeping, like hardly ate, lived on coffee, like, was just so consumed by what was happening with my kids in Flint. And, I could have done what most academics do and published this research, these findings. And if anybody knows anything about academia, that is a long process to go through that peer review process to get something published. So it takes months, sometimes it takes years to get something published. And so that wasn't an option. And I think, I've gotten so many humbling accolades during the last few years. And I think my favorite is an award that I got from MIT, called the Disobedience Award for which was awesome, but like very difficult to explain to my children that I got a disobedience award. But it was this award for being academically disobedient, for like not going through that peer review process and sharing my research publicly at a press conference, which is once again not something that academics or doctors do. But it had to be done because this information had to be public, to inform families and children and to demand action. So it was a risk, right? It was a risk to do this. It was also a risk, not just because like I hadn't gone through the peer review process, but it was a risk because everybody before me who had raised any concerns about the water was attacked. So from the amazing moms to the pastors, to the list goes on. Everybody who had raised any red flag about the water was dismissed and denied. And there's a scene in the book that I love that my brother had just come to town the weekend before I was having this press conference. And my brother, went to Michigan State, and then he went to U of M for law school, and he was in town for his U of M law school reunion. And he's a public interest lawyer in DC. He represents workers and unions. And he's like, he knew something was going on. He's like, Mona, what's going on? And he's like, and I'm like, oh, I did this research and there's this thing with the water, and I'm going to go public with this research at a press conference to share this research and to protect kids. And he's like, Mona, you're a whistleblower. I'm like, I am not a whistleblower. Like, I'm just doing my job. I'm a scientist. I'm a pediatrician. I'm just protecting kids. He's like, Mona, I'm a whistleblower lawyer. I'm like, you are? Like, I had no idea you were a whistleblower lawyer. He's like, yes, be careful. He was telling me, he's like, I've had clients, like when they go public, they are retaliated against and they're intimidated against and they lose their jobs. And he's like, I just had a client that actually committed suicide because of kind of going public. He's like, it's going to be hard. And I'm like, it's going to be okay. Like, it's, I mean, can you guys imagine like being in the middle of a public health crisis and like not listening to science? So that's a joke because like we've all been through the pandemic, right? So it's kind of hard in the Zoom audience, but that's sarcasm. But but I'm like, I have to do this. So like I knew going into this that I would expect some sort of backlash, but really nothing can prepare you, for when that happens. So, obviously and that's one of the reasons this book is written in the first person, because I wanted you to step in my shoes and go through every single emotion I was going through, that roller coaster of ups and downs. And that was purposeful, why, and why this book was written in the first person. So yeah, there was a lot of backlash, like as I should have anticipated, because of everybody, the backlash everybody else had gone through. And that was physically hard. It was emotionally hard. There was a lot of, second guessing. There was a lot of that imposter syndrome. Like, oh, maybe, when they were telling me that I was causing near hysteria, that I, dismissing my work, dismissing me, like, it's hard not to feel this big. Like, it's hard not to feel tiny. Like, who am I? Like, I am barely 5 foot tall, a brown woman immigrant going against like the most powerful people, like, not only in the state, but in the nation. Like the feds were also saying I was wrong. So it's hard not to second guess yourself. It's hard not to feel belittled. It's, I had just gotten a Fitbit. Like, obviously I'm a doctor and I could feel my heart rate, but like, it was like glaring at me, like close to 200. I was shaking. So like, it was also just, physically and emotionally hard. But what kept me going and so that I didn't get depressed, like someone asked in the comments, that I didn't give up, is the quick realization that this has nothing to do with me. Like, they can go after Dr. Mona all they want, but this is not about me. This is about my kids. And it was this realization that like, yeah, I'm sharing science and numbers and statistics and p-values, but like every number literally represented a child, and maybe even a kid I'd seen and cared for in the last year or so. And it's my job as a pediatrician to protect kids. Like that's why I became a doctor, but implicit in the story is, doctor or not, it is our civic responsibility, no matter who we are or where we are, to protect kids. So that's what lifted me up and kept me going, is this everyday grounding in that my work is about kids. And that's what enabled me to write this book, which I never thought I would write. That's what, that's why I do what I do to this day, is I ask myself, why, Mona, why are you doing this? And my why is always kids. And what, and kind of what is best for them.
Well, let me ask you about that process. I mean, you're talking about, academic writing is so different, as you said, science and data and numbers and p-values. In this book, you're weaving in all this, as you said, the vulnerabilities of feeling this small. Talk about the process. Did you always know that you would weave together this personal story with the water crisis? Or did it develop along the way?
Yes. So first of all, like when I went to medical school, I did not intend to be an author. Like, this was never part of like what I was going to be when I grew up, was writing a book. However, I am a reader. I grew up in our local library. I always have a book in my bag. Like, I love literature. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a journalist when I grew up. Like, I was the editor of our school newspaper. I stayed another year at Michigan to take creative writing classes. Like, I love reading and I love writing, but that was never anything I was going to do, with my life. But then again, I never thought I would be in the center of this crazy story. So, after the water crisis became national news, I was contacted by all these people and professions that I had never heard about, like, agents and publishers and editors and screenwriters and like movie producers are like, oh, they're like, you need to tell your story. I'm like, go the F away. Like, I'm so busy. Like, we just exposed this crazy crisis, but like, sleeves rolled up, our work was even more after that to mitigate the impact of the crisis. I'm like, there's no way that I am going to like write a book after like neglecting my work and my family for like a year or ish, you know? So there was a lot of like, no way I'm going to write a book. I just don't have time. I just can't. Like, as much as I love literature and, you know, narratives and what have you, there's no way. And that all changed when I met my editor. So I was at an event in Washington, D.C. It was actually a whistleblower event in Washington, D.C. And this guy came up to me and he's like, you know, have you thought about writing a book? I'm like, go away. And he's like, but then he shared who he was and what he does. And he runs a division in Penguin Random House, which is a really big publishing company, probably the biggest. And there's like divisions within a publishing company, like, you know, the people who do children's books and YA and romance novels and whatever. There's like different, they call them imprints. And he ran an imprint called One World, and he still does. And that division is committed to diversity in literature and also social justice stories. And he shared with me the other authors that he has brought to life, like Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, and Trevor Noah, and Ibram Kendi, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the list goes on, of authors that I adore, that, you know, that whose books were written not to sell books, but whose books were written to make the world a better place, essentially. So that's kind of how I said yes. That I knew that the story would be in good hands, that once again, it wouldn't be about, you know, just selling books, but it would be about inspiring change and sharing a story, but sharing a story that's not a unique story. It's a story that's happening everywhere, not just about water, but really essentially how we care for each other. So then, like I said, the initial story was just going to be Flint. But then very quickly, I'm like, I can't just tell you what happened in Flint without including so much other stuff. The personal history, the family history, Michigan history, Flint history, public health history, lead history. So there's a lot of history in this book. And I think there's a line in the book that says, you know, we step over history every day. Yet as a nation, we do a really good job closing our eyes to history, especially when it's dark and complicated. And I was always taught, and it's something that I teach my learners, that, you know, to really understand where we are, and more importantly, to understand and to try to figure out how to move forward, it starts by looking back. So that's why a lot of not only the personal and family history are in there, but also, you know, lead history and public health history and Michigan history and Flint history. If you understood Flint history, you could have almost predicted the water crisis. So this book became there's so many rabbit holes in this book. I exceeded my word count limit. Like, I had a 75,000 word count limit from the publisher, from the editor. And I could have kept writing for years. And my editor's like, Mona, you just need to turn this in. I'm like, no, I'm not done. I want to keep writing and fixing. And this one comma here that needs to be fixed. I'm a totally type A. Like, I could have gone on writing and researching forever. And it ended up being like almost 100,000 words. Fortunately, not much was cut, but there's a lot of rabbit holes, you know, in here. You know, I'll share a couple. One is about one of my heroes, Alice Hamilton, you know, who is this amazing physician from a century ago. She graduated from Michigan's medical school in like 1893. She went to work with Jane Addams at the Hull House. She quickly became our nation's expert on lead poisoning a century ago. First woman professor at Harvard, and like her whole life was fighting for poor people and going against really powerful forces to protect especially children. So she's one of my heroes. A century ago, she went after General Motors and Standard Oil when they were putting lead in gasoline. And I read 3 books about her, and she's in here for like a paragraph. So there was so much kind of background research and kind of digressions in the story. But they were important to include because they've made me who I am, and they informed kind of my worldview and my perspective. And they also pay tribute to giants whose shoulders I am privileged to stand on.
Sorry, I had a phone call come in. First of all, I have to tell you, I love the fact that this cat behind Sue's head looks so happy to be here. I don't know if you can see that or not.
My cat's over here. I'm sure my cat will make this too.
So I know in your book, you explain briefly why you chose the title, but I think it bears repeating because I think, we may have missed that. I would think choosing a title would be so tough.
Yeah.
Why this?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. So there were many really hard parts to writing a book. The time, the research, like this was all on top of work. It was nights and weekends. Ending the book was really hard. Like there was the weaving of, these seemingly disconnected but very connected stories. But I think choosing a title was probably one of the hardest. I had 8 pages of title options. A lot of folks were like, you have to put the word Flint or the word water or, something in there, it was really, really difficult to choose a title. And I settled on What the Eyes Don't See because I didn't settle. I love it. It's a great title. And I'll tell you why I love it and kind of what it means. So, it means the very literal, like we actually don't see lead in water. It's clear, it's colorless. If you guys remember pictures from Flint, like that brown water, like that was from iron corrosion causing that rusty colored water. Lead in waters, you don't see it. So that's one reason. You also don't see the effects of lead right away. It's known as a silent pediatric epidemic. So it's not something that presents acutely. So that's another reason. I also, first heard the phrase when I was a training pediatrician in Detroit at the Children's Hospital. One of the head doctors used to always say, when we were stuck, like if we didn't have the right answer, like we were rounding on patients, seeing, patients in the ICU. And if we didn't have, we didn't know the pathophysiology, or we couldn't come up with a long enough differential diagnosis, or if we didn't know something, he would always yell at us and say, the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know. Basically saying you need to read more and learn more because you'll never know what you're missing. So that also speaks to like my not knowing that there could be lead in water. Like I've cared for hundreds, of patients with lead poisoning, and I never ever thought that you would have that water would be a source of lead. So like I didn't know that, so I didn't see that, and I didn't diagnose that, and I didn't treat that. And that's kind of writ large the medical community largely pre-Flint. It also means our eyes don't see. So in this book I talk a lot about like early adversity and toxic stress and trauma in children and kind of its manifestations over time. And often when we like see patients or see people, we don't really see the history and the kind of what really made them sick. I think I often say doctors are really myopic. We see what's in front of us, but we don't really have a good grasp of all the other determinants that make people sick, especially in environmental health. There's a poem that I include in the book that kind of speaks to that. It's really short. I'm going to read it to you guys. It's one of my favorite poems. I give it to my my trainees, and it's a poem that was written in 1938, and it's called A Worker's Speech to a Doctor. And it says, "When we're sick, we hear, you are the one who will heal us. When we come to you, Our rags are torn off, and you tap around our naked bodies. As to the cause of our sickness, a glance at our rags would tell you more. It is the same cause that wears out our bodies and our clothes. So I love that poem. Like it, and even though it was written almost a century ago, it's still so true today because, my patients, my kids, their life trajectory is not so much predicted based on like the medical care that they get. Health medicine contributes to only like 10 to 15% of health outcomes. It's so many other things that we fail to see, like poverty and racism and systemic inequities and, nutrition and food access and housing insecurity and all these other things that play such a huge role in how our patients end up. I talk about this in the book, but a kid in Flint, there's a 15 to 20 year difference in life expectancy based on their zip code, their census tract, compared to another part of our county. And that's not unique to Flint. You can put these addresses in. There's a CDC website. You can put an address in and compare it to other places. So throughout this country, where you grow up is one of the greatest predictors of how you end up. And that's not okay. And we need to see that. But the main reason I like this title, What the Eyes Don't See, because it speaks to the blindness that so many folks had in this story to Flint and to Flint's kids. There was this kind of, that's not my problem. They maybe created their own problem. This folks just kind of turned their heads to what was happening to that community and those children. But it's also about the ability that we all have to open our eyes and to see what's happening, not just in Flint, but all over, and to take action. So, as much as this story is a story of a crisis, of a crime, committed against some of the most vulnerable people in the country, I also wrote this story to be a playbook on how to see injustices, no matter where they may be, and more importantly, how to take action. So yes, the story is a story of a crisis, but it's also this amazing story of resistance and teamwork and fighting the status quo and doing the impossible and creating hope in a community. So that's what the title means.
Well, let me ask you a little more about that. I mean, and I got that from the book that, this is a story about crisis, but about what each of us can do. And you described Flint as being a man-made state of emergency for 40 years. So you talked about it a little bit, but how did, more specifically, how did government policies, the structural racism and deindustrialization play roles? And then secondly to that, how in the world do we make a difference in something like that?
Yeah. So I'm going to read you a section. So, I saw some people commented too about like the criminal charges that were dropped and like who should be culpable and all that. So in the intro of the book, people ask me all the time about like the villains, like who should go to jail, like what about that person, who's responsible for this? And I say there are lots of villains in this story. A disaster of this scale does not happen completely by accident. Many people stop caring about Flint and Flint's kids. Many people look the other way. People in power made tragic and terrible choices, then collectively and ineptly try to cover up their mistakes. While charges have been brought against some of the individuals who are culpable, the real villains are harder to see. And Robin, this is what you were alluding to, because the real villains live underneath the behavior and drive it. The real villains are the ongoing effects of racism, inequality, greed, anti-intellectualism, that's also this anti-science, and even laissez-faire neoliberal capitalism. These are powerful forces most of us don't notice and don't want to. These villains poison Flint with policy. So let's go back to figure out how this all happened. So you guys tell me, what was Flint famous for like a long time ago? You guys all know this. You can put in the chat or you can scream it out. GM winner, extra credit, GM. So Flint was the birthplace of cars, right? So cars were born in Flint, and And what else was born in Flint? And I talk about this in the book, and I love this part. So what else was born in Flint shortly after cars were born? This is audience participation. So people were really working hard, making cars. Oh, the unions. Oh my God, everybody wins. UAW, auto unions. Yes, yes, yes. So you know, the workers, they were, you know, working hard, and but they weren't getting a fair share of prosperity. And on the days that they made red cars, they were coughing up red. And the days they made blue cars, they were coughing up blue, and they were losing digits. And so the workers did something crazy and disobedient and like illegal. And they had they went on strike, and this was the Flint sit-down strike, also known as the strike that was heard around the world. And for 44 days, and you know, in the Michigan winter, they literally sat down and stopped production of cars. And they won. President Roosevelt, you know, then Governor kind of Murphy, you know, recognized their union, and the UAW was born. And more importantly, what was born was the middle class was born in America. And that started in Flint, and that informed wages across the country. You know, people came to Flint from all over the world, immigrants and you know, African Americans in the Great Migration North, fleeing the oppression and racism of Jim Crow South, came to Flint like they came to Detroit and Chicago and other places for a chance at that American dream, right? For a chance at prosperity and a chance at equality, something that wasn't afforded to them or their, you know, ancestors, but something they were hoping for themselves and their descendants. So Flint was this, like, literally this promised land. And for a long time, you know, we had great infrastructure and great housing and great schools. Community schools was born in Flint, and, you know, all these awesome things. And not even that long ago, the early 1980s, Flint had the highest per capita income in the country. Like, can you believe that? Like, can you believe that? Like, the highest per capita income. People in Flint made the most money than any other city in the country in the early 1980s. That wasn't that long ago. But then what happened after that? So, you know, then, you know, there was disinvestment, right? Plants closed. So they went to cheaper places, or there was automation, all these other reasons why, you know, plants closed, jobs were lost, the power of the unions decreased, and people who could leave the city left, and white flight happened. And then a lot of people who couldn't leave the city because of historic kind of real estate practices, be it blockbusting or redlining, stayed in the city, and the city became increasingly segregated and increasingly poor with high rates of unemployment. So, you know, the city was in crisis for a long, long time, you know, because, and, you know, they lost revenue sharing from the state. So they'd been suffering from like neglect and disinvestment. And when the water crisis happened, there's people in Flint that actually are like, they thought it was purposeful. They're like, look, see, here's another way that they're trying to get rid of us. Like, this is a purposeful genocide. You know, that's how much trust had already been kind of severed between the institutions that were charged with keeping people healthy and safe and the residents, you know, in the community. So then, you know, other bad things happened, and I like talking about this. So, like, you guys tell me, what happened in 2011 to Flint and to many other cities in Michigan that precipitated the water crisis. So, the people of Michigan voted this down in a statewide ballot. They said, we don't want unelected, unaccountable financial emergency managers, Robin Wins, running our cities. But it was pushed through our legislature, despite being against the will of the people in this kind of statewide ballot proposal, and it was signed by the governor. So in 2011, because of kind of Flint's dire financial state, because of huge loss of population, loss of tax base, inability to kind of, you know, have any kind of revenue, Flint joined other Michigan cities and lost democracy, was under financial emergency management. So I want to spend a little time on this, because this is important, and it's important to kind of the election that's happening in a month. It's like, this is a city, like so many cities in our state, that literally lost democracy. And we had national media on the Flint story way before the water crisis happened, just when we were a story of usurped democracy, because it was so like bizarre and un-American that these unelected, unaccountable officials were running so many of our cities, and the cities that had emergency managers were predominantly majority minority cities. At one point in Michigan, half of our Black population was under emergency management, compared to just 2% of our white population. And folks are like, oh, this was just kind of unique. This is not, this is not anything that should happen again or did happen again. But this is no different than other efforts that are happening right now across the country that thwart democracy, that make it hard for majority minority individuals to have a say in government, be it, voter ID laws or gerrymandering or what have you. So this is not unique. So there's a great movie you can watch called Slay the Dragon, which actually starts with the Flint water crisis story about how our democracy was taken away. And then it goes on to kind of gerrymandering and the story across the nation about threats to democracy. So I don't know where it's streaming, but it's a great movie. It's about Michigan. It's called Slay the Dragon. So Flint lost democracy, and it was the emergency managers, and there was like a series of 4 of them, and once again, unaccountable, unelected, and their job was austerity. It was just about saving money, no concern for the environment or public health. And Detroit had emergency managers, and they kind of had the A team, but Flint kind of had the B team, and they made the decision. That's how the decision was made to change our water source to save money. So I don't actually remember what the initial question was, but it was like, so like, if you understand all that history, you could have literally predicted that, Flint would be in such a state that this would happen. So learn history, embrace history, teach history, write about history, so that we can continue to move forward.
Actually, to that end, we had some reader questions, and I was going to ask you about this too. Just last week, we had a judge decide that, basically drop the felony charges against the 7 former government officials. And, I was struck, you wrote, or you read a little bit of your book earlier, and I was struck by this passage. You're talking about somebody who sends you an email at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're so very adamant about this. You said this email is truly a remarkable demonstration of cover your ass and cluelessness all at the same time. Blah, blah, blah. No urgency, no heightened concern. The rest of it was a bunch of long-winded, know-nothing, bureaucratic talk. The water had poison in it. It's pretty clear that you feel people did very, very wrong here. This wasn't just an act of omission. This was commission. Given that the charges were dropped last week, do you believe anybody will ever be really held fully accountable for this?
I don't know. I used to not answer these questions, and I used to deflect and be like, oh, ask, somebody else, ask the lawyers. But then the more, embedded I've been in the community and the work, and, I've begun to realize that this concept of justice and restorative justice is a health issue. It's a doctor issue too. I think of the water crisis as a wound. It is this injustice that happened atop of historic injustice, right? Like we talked about that historic injustice, but it is this open wound. And without some element of justice, that wound does not heal, and it stays open, and it is a trauma that is raw. And that is what I see every day in Flint. This is justice significantly delayed, and for many people it feels like justice denied. It's been about 6-ish years. There was the former administration, criminal charges were going on for about 3 years, and then the new administration restarted them, and that was about 3-ish years, and now they're all been dropped. So I don't know. I have no idea if anybody will be held accountable. I've also come to learn and understand that you can ask 10 people about what justice it means to them, and you will get 10 different answers. There was a settlement in the civil cases, and the majority of those damages did go to children. A lot went to lawyers, but a lot did go to children. But not many people have signed up for that class action, that settlement. I think only last I heard about 13,000 people or something. There's a lot of, trust issues as well. So I don't know what's going to happen. But it hurts people. It impedes healing and recovery. And I think this is also an important lesson about not just Flint, but about historic injustices everywhere. When we fail to have truth and accountability and restorative justice, we fail to heal from any historic injustices. And I think this is, once again, not a lesson just for Flint, but for a lesson, for our nation when we fail to come to terms with bad things that have happened in the past.
Let me ask you about those kids. I mean, you do this, these kids, the description of these kiddos that you're working with at the time, do you still keep in contact with them and their families? How are they doing?
Of course. Yes. So that's what keeps me going is my, my interaction with our kids. I'm still a pediatrician. I'm still seeing patients. I now run this big initiative where we run the Flint registry, which is a CDC funded effort to see how people are doing and then get them connected to services. We do lots of other awesome programming like literacy and nutrition prescriptions and parenting support. So we've been able to build a lot of awesome in Flint, and I continue to interact, with kids and their parents. And, we talked about how Flint was this story where democracy was taken away and where people weren't being listened to and heard. So part of recovery is kind of this very deliberate role of participatory democracy and self-determination. So my work has always been done really kind of in humble shoulder-to-shoulder partnership with the community. And we've tried to kind of formalize it many different ways. For example, I have a director of community engagement, like on my leadership team. I just had a call with her about an hour ago. And we have a parent and advisory group, a group of parents that from all parts of the city, and grandparents and foster parents and moms and dads that we meet with now for years, who tell us what we should be doing and inform our work. But my favorite thing that I do is I have a group of kids that tell me what I should be doing. And they've named themselves the Flint Youth Justice League. And they're a badass group of kids, like 8 to 18. And like you guys heard me, like I love talking. Like I can talk forever. Like I talk. But I close my mouth and I listen. And I listen to what the kids care about and what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. And our kids are amazing. They're amazing. And they've become, in their own right, national leaders. As I'm sure you're aware of, I said this at a recent congressional testimony, Flint wasn't the worst water crisis. It wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last. Since Flint happened, there's been many other very similar issues that have happened throughout our nation. And a couple of years after Flint, there was a similar water crisis in Newark, New Jersey. Also predominantly poor, minority population, denials and what have you. And our Flint kids were Zooming with kids in Newark, New Jersey and telling them what a part per billion was and telling them like what they should be advocating for and what they should be doing. So yes, I'm so lucky to continue to be able to interact with our children, to learn from them, but really to use my power and privilege to elevate their voices, so that they can, do this amazing work.
Are you involved? Not that you don't have enough on your plate, but are you interacting with the medical community at all in Benton Harbor
Yeah. So,
or others in Benton Harbor?
yeah, I was one of the signatories of the letter to the EPA asking for them to get involved in Benton Harbor, which kind of made it a story. So I've been involved. I've been working, more closely with the advocacy groups, the water groups, the NRDC, who's amazing, the Natural Resources Defense Council. They're the environmental lawyers. Also, gave a talk to the hospital there, to the medical community about kind of lead in general, lead in water. Met with the mayor early on of Benton Harbor. So if somebody asks for help, I'm more than happy, to support and to share the lessons that we've learned. So a lot of my work now is not about Flint. A lot of it's still about Flint, but a lot of it is about making sure this doesn't happen in other places. The bio was awesome. It said I testified twice before Congress. It's actually up to 5 times now that I've testified before Congress, and another time is next week. And my national advocacy is about making sure these kinds of things don't happen in other communities. So the last couple of times I had a privilege to testify before Congress was about the National Infrastructure Act, which was the largest federal investment in water, and it is the largest federal investment in removing lead pipes across the nation. So it included, I don't know, $15 billion to remove like the lead pipes. It's not enough, but it's huge. It's amazing. The last time I still have so something you learn from the book is that you need optics and props and the power of storytelling. I think you guys, many of you know that in journalism, but the last time I testified before Congress, I shared with them this lead pipe. So, and it was a virtual testimony. Obviously you can't bring a lead pipe into Congress because we all know it can also be a weapon. So I shared, this is one of the first lead pipes that was excavated in Flint. I know the family that this came from. I know the kid who drank water from here. I know what happened to the kid. The Brown family, the great-grandfather moved from Alabama to Flint in the 1950s as part of that great migration north. He first lived in this Black-only neighborhood. He worked for Buick, moved to this house. Generations of family lived there and drank from this water. And I went like this, and I shared with the legislators that a lead pipe is like a straw, right? Doesn't it look like a straw? And millions of kids, including this family, have been drinking through a straw made of poison. No safe level. So I hope, and then I also shared a lot of science and numbers and facts, but they don't care about that. I hope they just retained that image of that crazy lady with the pipe and the straw, and that kids are drinking through a straw. So that passed. That Infrastructure Act was a really big deal. And so not only have I worked with other communities like Benton Harbor, Newark, and Jackson, and the list goes on, but it's also about making sure that we continue, we don't do these kinds of things again.
My last question is, how in the world is our hour almost up?
I know.
That was fast. And there were so many questions we didn't get to. I'm going to turn this back to Josiah, but first I have 2 things. I have a call out to readers, and I want to thank you first, Dr. Mona, for taking the time. You have 1,000 things on your plate. I know this. Every time something happens in Flint, anytime, it seems like you're in the news a lot, and I see your name a lot. So thank you for taking the time with Bridge readers. And for anybody who hasn't read the book, it really, really is a good read. Secondly,
I'll just say, like Oprah said, it has the gripping intrigue of a Grisham thriller, per Oprah. So yeah, so who knew science could be a page turner, like, right?
Oprah, what am I, chopped liver? Hey, I do have a totally different call out right before I turn this back over to Josiah. I am working on a completely different story tomorrow, and I'm going to put my number in the chat. This is a story about Medicare open enrollment and the difficulty of choosing policies, because it's really complex. I would love to talk to some Bridge readers about that. I'm going to put my number in the chat right now. if anybody is working on this or will be getting newly enrolled in the next couple of days, I'd love to talk to you today. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Mona. Thank you, readers. And I'll turn this back over to Josiah. I hope everybody has a fantastic day.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. Me and Amber, we're just so grateful for both of you guys just to come and just talk about your book and the creative writing process and just about the current state of things. It's just so amazing. Thank you guys. And thank you. I want to thank our audience for coming, taking an hour out of their day in the middle of the day just to be with us. It truly means a lot to us. All right, I just want to brush up on some things. So I want to remind you guys that we will be posting this recording on our website this week. So be on the lookout for that. I want to announce that this is our last book club of the year, but next year we'll be starting our book club. So in 2023, if you have any suggestions for our next book, you can contact me or Amber. We will put our contact information on the Bridge post, and just hit us up with some ideas of what you want to see next year. Then I want to remind you guys, if you are a member, you receive our next book for free. So if you donated to us in the past year, or if you donate soon, the book clubs in 2023, it'll be available to you for free. So I want to thank you guys again for showing up and just taking an hour out of your day. Have a great day, have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you guys soon.